Hello, and welcome to Support, Control, and Structure, a self-care training for educators in a climate of uncertainty. This training is brought to you today by the Mental Health Association of Monmouth County, the Society for the Prevention of Teen Suicide, and the YMCA of Greater Monmouth County. Your presenters today are Susan Talone, the Clinical Director at the Society for the Prevention of Teen Suicide, and Nicole Nolan, the Adolescent Grant Coordinator at the Mental Health Association of Monmouth County. Before we get started today, I thought it was important for you, the trainees, to meet us, the trainers. Susan, why don't you let everybody know a little bit about your education history?
Sure. Prior to coming to SBTS, I was in education for over 14 years, and I recently retired only 4 years ago. But during my tenure, I was certified school nurse, educator, anti-bullying specialist, and I was crisis coordinator. And I worked I worked K through 12 different times in my career, and I've had the experience of working with gifted and talented in our health science curriculum, and I also have had the other side of the spectrum where I've worked with special education. So I really know both sides of that, and I can't imagine what this pandemic has done to educators. I have walked in your shoes, and I can know what you've gone through, and I want to help you through that today, and hopefully we can tackle some of those issues.
Thanks, Susan. You bring a wealth of knowledge to the topic today, and I'm really happy that you're going to be able to help educators. In addition to my position as the Adolescent Grant Coordinator for Suicide Prevention at the Mental Health Association, I'm also a school counselor in Monmouth County, and I'm walking this walk with you guys right now as we all plan for what reopening looks like in September.
The world we are living in. We all know what we've been through over the last several months, and we really don't want to spend a lot of time looking back. We want to look ahead and to see what we're anticipating coming up. We do want to review some of the challenges that we've been through. For example, while there's been a variety of explanations for how the world got into the space we're in, we're still not exactly sure if we have the collective will to get ourselves safe again. We're optimistic about a vaccine, and while we all want to believe it will be available soon, there's a variety of medical questions that we don't know. We really don't have the answer to. What will that mean for us at the end of the day? A lot of us remain worried. And when we are anticipating so many unknowns about the future, we can experience what they call anticipatory anxiety. When we don't know what to expect, our anticipation can actually be worse than the reality. It's important to recognize that this feeling is on an unconscious level and that we are collectively going through this together. Practical things in our lives like our finances have changed. If we have college-age kids, the whole experience can be disrupted, upsetting for not just them, but for us as well. So much of what we've looked forward to has changed. And even when our entire family has experienced the same events, it's rare that every one of them feels the same way about it. And I have a saying I like to say, we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. As we struggle to regroup and confront the widespread issues and concerns of going back to school, we realize there are so many layers to a crisis. And we look at what stresses us as we are returning to school. We realize there's just so many unknowns. Is it safe? What if we get sick? How do you adapt to continuous changes? We understand that no matter how well we seem to be coping, something can always happen to change our world overnight. And I think that's what we've learned through COVID. And although the COVID crisis has created so many challenges, it also has created the opportunity for positive change. A crisis can reveal our true strengths and help us prepare for any further issues that we may encounter down the road. And maybe we even have a chance of doing things better than we've ever done them before. We may have been less prepared when COVID first hit, but we actually have learned to deal with the unexpected better than we ever thought possible. And building on what we've learned is really the first step to resiliency. So we want you to think about teaching from a place of strength and not fear. And that's the attitude that you must lead with as we go back to school. Strength and not fear. One thing we can do to cope better with stress is to pay attention to the way we are thinking about things. You know, there's an old saying that goes, whether you believe you can or you believe you can't, you're probably right. Self-talk and what we say to ourselves is really important to strengthening our mindset and allows that mind to focus on the positive, healthy ways of thinking. You know, you have heard you are what you eat. I always say you are what you think. So teaching from that place of strength and not fear is that attitude that I hope we can bring through this whole training. Exhibiting confidence that you will get through this together, but also allowing the time to share with your colleagues what you've been through and eventually with your students. We'll build that feeling of connectiveness that is really what schools are all about, and so many of us in schools feel like a family. So by putting this into a broader context, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about stress, and let's look at it a little bit deeper. So what is stress? Stress is your body's reaction to a real or perceived demand that may be beyond your resources to cope with. It's a physiological, emotional, and a behavioral reaction that is fed by biology, the biology of the brain, fight or flight. Stress means different things to different people, and what causes stress in one person may be of little concern to another. Some people are better able to handle stress than others, and not all stress is bad. It's what gets us up in the morning in small doses. It's what helps you accomplish the things you set out to do during the day. It prevents you from getting hurt. You put your foot on the brake when you're driving a car. So your bodies are designed to handle small doses of stress. But what happens when we're under a chronic level of stress? This can have potentially bad effects on all of us. So as I just went over, there are two different kinds of stress. Actually, there's more than two different kinds of stress. But one thing I want to talk to you now about is acute stress. This is the short-term stress that goes away quickly. Like we talked about, you feel it when you slam on the brakes in a car. It's not necessarily a bad thing. We all have acute stress at one time or another. And it can be exciting. It can get you motivated to do things. And then there is chronic stress, which is a stress that lasts for that longer period of time, and it goes on for weeks or months. And actually, COVID-19 has been the perfect setup for chronic stress. So we really need to think about managing this stress because we don't want it to lead to health issues. And although the stressors may be different, the fallout from COVID, we can manage it. There are ways we can cope. And adapting and looking at how we can do that is just what we want to do in the next few slides.
For those of you who have taken trainings before with Susan and I, you know that we always have some key words for you to walk away with. And I think that these three may be ones that you've already heard, but are going to be critical to getting us through the COVID-19 crisis as we return to school. Susan, you want to let them know what those three words are?
Support, control, and structure. And really, this is the framework for any crisis you're in. But moving forward, I think these three words will really help you as you manage the stress of the upcoming months ahead.
So, how do we get through chronic stress? Step 1, by reinforcing support. Going back to school is stressful as it is already, and now our worries are amplified with COVID-19. As we discussed, you all have a myriad of worries that may be impacting your ability to teach. But what I've always known about teachers is your incredible ability to be resilient in the wake of changes and overhauls. You are able to create meaningful and memorable lessons and achieve academic milestones for your students with incredibly limited resources. What is most important now, however, is your connection to each other. Now more than ever, you will need the support and connection of your fellow teachers. This is the time to reinforce those informal traditions that you all love so much. Whether it be morning coffee, after-school hangouts, or any other activities that you have all known throughout the years and missed especially during the past several months that we've been on lockdown. One of our recommendations during this time has been to start a teacher-initiated wellness and support clubs. Several of the schools that we've worked with have incorporated this into their crisis team by having a small working group of teachers who have volunteered to lead this initiative. It could include things like going to yoga classes, a walk club, or book, podcast, or TV clubs. Whether you are able to create a formal group with your administrative support, or if you have to create an informal one outside of school for your colleagues, remembering that you are all experiencing the same stressors at this time and having that group bond will help you process your school day in a way that is much different from your conversations with non-educators. However, we have to think about the fact that support doesn't always come from external sources. You need to know how to support yourself. There's an internal community and an external community. And what we're going to focus on for the next couple of slides is how we get support and self-care through our conversations internally with our own self. What do you do when no one else is around? I'm going to go back to what I had just asked you. How do you treat yourself when no one else is around, when it's just you and yourself? How do you support yourself during times of uncertainty? One of the activities that you had in your workbook that we hope you were able to look at and do before this training was a nice reflection on your time in shutdown and during the lockdown that we experienced for the past several months. I want you to reflect on those questions and think about both the positive and the negative sides of being away from our school buildings. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that may have looked like for you, but also some really healthy ways that you can continue to support yourself during this time and as we make our way back to our school buildings. All right, guys, so how do we continue to support ourselves during times of uncertainty? First, as Susan mentioned before, avoid fear-based teaching. Don't focus on the bad things that might happen. For example, what would happen if we don't follow safety guidelines? But think about the good that comes along with those guidelines, like maybe when we consider not just our own safety, but the safety of others. If you think about it for yourself, it will be an easier mindset to role model and maintain for your students. I want you to recognize the value of your own experience. We all know that the hardest time to adjust to something is in the very beginning. You've got this, and we've gotten through the beginning. We're somewhere in the middle of all of this, and while we might not have figured out everything, there's a lot of change we've gotten already under our belts. You can do this. You have been doing it, and if there's one thing I know about teachers, is you guys are able to adapt. I want you to remember how to counteract helplessness with helpfulness. There's a reason we volunteered at food banks, or made donations, or reached out to healthcare workers and essential employees. It's because we always feel better when we're not sitting helplessly in the sidelines and when we get up and do something to help someone else. It doesn't have to be a grand gesture. Sometimes just a text message saying, "I'm thinking about you, how are you doing?" is good enough to brighten our day and someone else's as well. I want you to practice mindful ways of coping. You don't have to be a Zen master to take a few minutes to smell a flower, watch a cloud float by, or look at silly videos on YouTube or anything else that might bring you a quick moment of joy. Sure, meditation is great, but if there's one thing I know about teachers, we don't have a couple of minutes to go ahead and meditate, especially with our kids running around. Set your sights on some of these more realistic suggestions. Finally, recognize the courage of help-seeking behaviors. There's a measure of bravery in asking someone else for help, but if there's one national message we are getting these days, it's you're not alone. We're all in this together. Some of what that means is we're there to help each other. The idea of doing something helpful that goes two ways, asking someone else for help or helping someone as well. So now that we've covered support, we're on to our next step, reinforcing control. The purpose here is for us to understand how we can feel in control when maybe our classroom is feeling out of control. We know one of your biggest worries as teachers in going back to school is how to control your students. I've heard so many questions in the past several days. Will my students wear masks? What if they take them off? I work with kindergartners. It's possible to think that they'll keep them on all day. Students may panic with masks. I have parents who will complain. All of our worries need to start feeling a little bit more under control. One aspect of educator self-care is trying to remain calm and in control when these things are very much out of our own control. Here it is a strong reminder that we must remember we cannot control everything, and sometimes we have to congratulate ourselves for simply doing the best that we can. When our students have behaviors that sometimes trigger our own anxiety or stress, it may be time to remember that they are also feeling a little out of control. By reinforcing control, both for yourself and for your students, you can help everyone, from the aides in your classrooms to your students, yourself, and eventually that will even trickle down to parents at home. Right now, I'd like you to open up your workbook and find a page entitled Reinforcing Control Activities. Here I want you to jot down 3 activities you think you can do in your classroom and with your students to reinforce control. Take a few seconds and think about something that would help your students come up for air. Thinking about this proactively will allow you to process and additionally seek out any additional information that you may need from your administrators. For example, one school has suggested that elementary students have access to the playground during the day if and when they need a moment to get their wiggles out. One of the things that we like to do with our trainings is make sure we give you guys realistic opportunities for change in your classrooms. Susan is going to talk to us a little bit about what has worked for her in her classroom, where she's been able to regain control and reduce her own stress as an educator when things were a little too crazy.
And I think this is a really important piece to think about. When we're always trying to keep the structure of our classroom, of our learning environment. But let's face it, there are times when we lose control. And I'm anticipating that with kids coming back to school after a long break of not being in that classroom, that structure is going to be even more difficult to manage. And that control is going to be even more difficult to manage. So I want you to start thinking about what things in the past have you done that have worked, and you're going to do them again. So in my past, I used to have this thing with some of my special ed kids where I'd say, I was lucky enough to have a dimmer. I would dim the lights, ask everyone, I would lower my voice, and have everyone to just take a breath because things were getting too loud in the classroom, too out of control. I also would do things like have them separate out a little bit. I would put on some music, some meditative music, and ask everyone to put their heads down, take 3 minutes to take a breath. But I think whatever you do it in the beginning of the year, and so you reflect on those throughout the year. It's time for our breath, and it's routine, right? We know support, control, and structure, and routine is a big piece of that puzzle. So building those things in the beginning of that school year, I think will give you that structure that you need to maintain the control of your classrooms.
And Susan, your high school students loved that, must have loved that.
They did. And I actually got my administrators to bring in yoga mats as part of the budget, because when I really needed to have kids come up for air, I would actually allow that. I had the space in my classroom to allow that. But you work within the constricts of your classroom, and now we've got social distancing and all these other things that are going to factor in. But you look at your classroom and you ask yourself, what can I do? What are the things I used to do, and what do I need to think about differently?
Susan had a lot of wonderful ideas about how we can maintain control when we are physically present in our classrooms and school buildings. But the question looming over a lot of our heads right now is, what will we do if we need to return to our virtual classrooms and provide remote learning? If you guys were anything like me at the beginning of the shutdown back in March, your entire home became your work office. In the morning, I would come downstairs to make coffee, and in my kitchen, I would take phone calls or Zoom meetings, anything else that I needed to do. I eventually found myself making my way to my living room or my dining room to do some writing or some notes, and almost always, by the end of the day, I would find myself upstairs with my laptop in my bed, sometimes until I fell asleep. This created a lot of chaos, not just for me, but for my family system, as they all worked from home as well. When I realized that we wouldn't be going back to school after the first 2-week period, I made a point to get a desk and create a designated workspace for myself somewhere in my home. What I found was this not only helped me become more effective at getting my work done, but it also helped my children feel a little bit more in control as their home became school as well. Another great opportunity to take a collective breath in your classroom and with your students is through a guided meditation. When I do this with students, I first ask, if you could be anywhere in the world but here in this classroom right now, where would you rather be? I then take one of the responses and I'll walk my students through that guided meditation. I focus on the 5 senses: sight, taste, smell, hearing, and feeling. I want to do this as an example for you so that you could see what it looks like and implement it into your classrooms this year. I want you to close your eyes and imagine that you are on a beautiful beach. Maybe it's a crowded beach or it's somewhere on a private island. What do you see? Is it water, sand, trees, or animals? Are you with family or friends? Next, I want you to focus on what you smell. Do you smell the salty beach air, or maybe the suntan lotion that you just put on? What can you hear? Is it quiet? Do you hear the laughter of family and friends? The crashing of the ocean waves against the shore? Are you tasting anything? Are you eating or drinking? What does it taste like? Is it refreshing? Is it delicious? But finally, what do you feel? Do you feel the sand in between your hands and toes? Do you feel the cool water? But more so, how are you feeling on the inside? Are you happy, excited, relieved? Do you finally feel at peace? I want you to slowly open your eyes and remember that feeling that you just had in that guided meditation. Now I want you to think, is this something that I could deliver in my own classroom to my students? And is it something that would work for me to be able to take a moment when I'm feeling a little out of control? Another way that you can maintain control, support, and structure for yourself during this time is to understand the things you can control and the things that aren't in your control. In your workbooks, you'll find a handout that looks pretty much just like this page. I want you guys to open up to that page and start thinking about things in your own life that you can control and things that are outside of your control. This goes back to the conflict that you have between internal communities and external communities. So, for example, let's look at the screen. Right here, things that you guys can control are your own efforts, asking for help, your thoughts, your belief systems, your attitudes and how you react to people in your family or at work or even people you don't know, taking care of yourself, how you respond and adapt to these continuous changes, your own mask and your own social distancing efforts. What are some things that are outside of your control? Think specifically about some of these worries that you may have about returning to school. Whether your students keep their masks on, what other teachers do or don't do, if students socially distance or follow other guidelines set out by your administration, what other people may say, how other people feel about returning to school, maybe the need for going back to virtual learning at some point during the school year. And certainly, we cannot control our students' parents' expectations. This is an activity that you can do in your workbook, and I encourage you to hang this up somewhere in your classroom or keep it close by in your desk so when you get those feelings of overwhelm and worry, you take this out and you remind yourself that you are only responsible for the things that you can control. And those things that you can't, you need to learn to let go and have peace with. All right, everyone, we are finally on our last step, and this is reinforcing structure. When we find ourselves in crisis thinking mode, we quickly feel out of control. Like Susan has mentioned earlier, years of crisis intervention theory and research has indicated the most efficient way to relieve stress and make better decisions is to have a plan in place, and this reinforces structure. Your classroom rules that you make with your students at the beginning of the year may look very different from the ones you've created in the past. Think about how to start conversations with students about maintaining distance, wearing masks, and washing hands. More importantly, these classroom rules are your opportunity to reinforce structure and provide support to yourself and your students as you both are feeling anxious about being back in your classrooms. In your workbook, you will find a sample classroom rules that was created by an elementary school preparing to go back. They met with a few students and talked about worries and anxieties about returning to school, and they came up with this list of classroom rules. Share these student-led classroom rules with your parents. Letting them know early on that their child play a role in creating these rules will also help you get that coveted parent buy-in. More importantly, how do you, the teacher, create structure for yourself? In returning to learning this year, it's going to be really challenging to feel safe during an unsafe time. One of the primary ways that I would like for you to think about doing this is to protect yourself through strong boundaries and early planning. What does this mean? Think about committing yourself to what you are reasonably capable of accomplishing. You need time to refill your cup at the end of a long day too. While what you may have had to do in the beginning of remote learning certainly rose to the occasion, you may find yourself now saying it's not sustainable for the long haul. Did you find yourself staying up late to post grades? Were you going above and beyond the call of your school hours? While you may have sprinted your way through the spring, remember, this school year is going to be a marathon. In the handout section of your workbook, there's a page called Reinforcing Structure and Activity. Here are some examples and comments from other educators who have worked hard to accomplish a healthy work-life balance. Now more than ever, you will need to prioritize your own mental health and wellness so that you can bring the best version of yourself to your classroom and to your students. As educators, we know that it's really hard to set those boundaries, and most of the time it's easier said than done. Susan, what are some of the things you were able to do as a high school teacher to set boundaries early on and kind of preserve your own mental wellness?
Well, pre-COVID, after school I would have my after-school hours, but I really had to stay strict to those hours because inevitably, the kids coming from sports would come in after my hours and want some extra help. But if I found that if I didn't maintain that structure, I became, lost for the day. And it was the same thing with after school emails. My students knew that I would answer their emails, but I wouldn't answer them after a certain hour because then it led into my evening. So really staying within the boundaries of what you're comfortable with your teaching structure is so, so important. And now, since COVID, I think it's more important than ever. Yeah. We need to really maintain our own mental health. And our students will respect our boundaries that we put in. They will respect what we put out there, but lay it out in the beginning. Yeah. Be consistent, stick with it, and everyone will start to feel safer within that structure.
Yeah. In speaking with a lot of educators, what we had found was setting that healthy work-life balance, especially from home. Many had shared that they were staying up very late to post grades or doing it as students submitted work. Susan, what do you think about that? Is that a recipe for disaster?
I really think it's a recipe for burnout. When you think about, coming into that classroom, vibrant every morning, you need your breaks, you need your rest, you need your evenings, you need your downtime. So when you elongate your day into the evening, it's just a recipe for exhaustion and burnout. And I think what you said earlier about it being, a marathon and not a sprint, we sprinted through that spring. We did everything we could to just keep things in place, but now we've really got to look at what works for us, what works for our students, and how are we going to navigate this year for the long haul, anticipating that things may change. So it's really about taking it one day at a time, but really setting those structures in place that support, control, and structure, and staying within those limits.
Yeah.
Taking care of yourself is really, really important.
What you can do with that workbook that we've given you is to fill out those boundaries and kind of think about them and make a commitment for the school year, but also to reward yourself. I know for me, Susan says turn off your computer by 8 o'clock at night, and I'm like, that's impossible. Maybe I could do 10. But maybe if I do it by 8, 5 days in a row, I get something really nice at the end of the week. It's a working document. So as we go through this year with all of our changes, if you notice that the boundary is not working for you and you have to change it, go ahead and change it. You're not going to stay constant throughout this year. We're going to grow and we're going to change, and there's a lot of room for growth.
And flexibility. I think that's what you're really saying, is that if you find that you set out to do something and it's not working, to have the ability to be flexible and say, okay, now I have to rethink that. That's not working, or my students need more than I thought they did, and so I have to rethink what I planned. Having that flexibility and being easy on yourself to maybe I didn't get through the lesson as I thought I was going to today, and it's okay, because balancing my mental health, their mental health, and academics is really the challenge of COVID and the return to school.
Finding a helpful perspective. Remember, don't take things too personally, especially in the beginning. It's going to take us all a little while to get back into our groove. Take a breath and get perspective. Remember what it is that you're really worried about and set your priorities. Try as much as possible to stay in the here and the now. Remember that activity we did, things you can control and things that are outside of your control. Identify the specific problem. Don't worry about anything else. Try not to catastrophize or add to that rumor mill. And lastly, work with your administration. They're here to support you. One of the things that we know for sure with the upcoming school year is that we will have to navigate around a few detours. While we may see it as a bump in the road, remember, it's a hurdle that you can overcome. Don't make assumptions. While there may be a new policy or a rule or a change in a different school district, don't assume that it necessarily will apply to yours as well. Try not to get too far ahead. Stay in the here and now and be present with the problem that's in front of you. Remember to be flexible. Things are going to change all the time. Focus more on the well-being of your students and remember the impact of those developmental disruptions that they've experienced over the past several months. Finally, recognize that you have developed skills since going into the school shutdown in March. All right, everybody, one of our favorite topics to talk about is our parents and what to do, especially when they seem like roadblocks, when we don't even know where the road is going at this point, especially with COVID and our way back to school. If you're a parent yourself, it may not be necessary to explain this slide. I know as a parent to 2 young children during this shutdown and being at home, I often found myself and some of my friends who were parents drifting along, so to speak, not quite sure where we were going or what our schools were doing, and really wondering if I was effective in the teaching that I was giving to my child, especially at such a young age. And that's why we chose this metaphor to illustrate this point. The reason most people get in the way is that they don't feel like they have directions, or they can't follow the directions that they do have. They're not interfering to be disruptive, at least most of them, even though it may feel that way sometimes. I want you to start by trying to put yourself in the parent's shoes, especially if you're not a parent yourself. Try not to be hard on them. Remember, they've been through something similar and are probably experiencing some of the same challenges you are getting back on track. Especially in the beginning of the year, you may want to cut them a little slack. If they feel like a roadblock as things improve, once schedules and plans are more settled and you have more structure, reach out and have a conversation with them. see if you can approach it from the positive perspective of, let's figure out how to work more productively together this year in the best interest of your child, rather than you are making things even more difficult for your child, and I think you're a mess. And we can't say it enough. Try not to take it personally, like you've learned to do about other things that happen in teaching that are now outside of your control. As we close out our training today, we want to remind you of some of the steps we've gone over for educator self-care. Reestablish connections, restart your traditions, seek administrative support early on, and stay positive. Focus on the support systems that you have developed while you are at home and in shelter in place. Continue to nurture them and add to your list of what helps you cope. This could include time management, routines, and positive self-talk. After today, we hope that it includes guided meditation, activities like things in and outside of your control, or even collective breaths with your students. Remember the importance of following the new protocols, which means staying informed on changes and updates. Try to keep your chin up. If you are experiencing anxiety and stress, talk to someone at your school who is a good listener, or if you feel like you need outside help or support, seek it. Remember, we're all in this together.
So in conclusion, I just want to take a moment to read this short poem and have a few comments at the end of our webinar. The first ones to map the stars also knew to map the dark places in between, because they saw the world as it was, whole and alive, and every path you take is never only one thing, but always threading between the known and the unknown, between where you are going and what you imagine that to be. And I think this poem really is poignant to where we stand today as we map our way back into our school systems and our school districts. And I just want to remind you that what you have done before in teaching, you will do again. And it was never totally easy. And it won't be easy this time. But I actually can imagine that it might even be better. So to not think of it as all negative, but actually as an opportunity to create a school year that may be more positive than ever before.
Before we end our training today, we just wanted to go over some additional resources that may help you during this time. In your workbook, you will find our COVID-19 specific resources for Monmouth County, as well as a listing of 2 upcoming trainings that we have for educators specifically. One is about navigating online learning and how to de-escalate with your students, and another one is specifically speaking about returning to learning and what that means for the whole competent caring community of schools, from administrators down to teachers, parents, and students. As we close out our training today, I just wanted to remind you that we are all in this together as we navigate our way back to our school buildings in September.
And if there's anything I know for sure, is that educators traditionally rise to every occasion. And I look forward to seeing how you all do just that. Have a great school year.
The Mental Health Association of Monmouth County, the Society for the Prevention of Teen Suicide, and the YMCA of Greater Monmouth County, thank you for participating in our training today. If you have any additional questions or would like more information about our program offerings, please contact me directly at ndmore@mentalhealthmonmouth.org.